G'day guys and gal, the Imperium has undergone some wacky times during its history. You gotta remember that the Great Crusade was only a couple centuries, the Heresy was only like 7 years or so, and the Scouring likewise wasn't that long either. On top of that, Guilliman has only been back in the current setting for a few years as well. So for like 99.99% of the Imperium's history, it's had no Primarchs guiding it and no Emperor to lead them. Thus, sometimes the Imperium would be ruled by very strange men, often mortal humans. In one instance, the Officio Assassinorum took over and actually did a surprisingly good job, at least for the most part, as they were sick of everyone's bullshit. Unsurprisingly, an assassin being the lord of humanity actually makes for some decent lore, so let's dive into that today. Before we get started, it's Friday baby, that means tequila, white girl music, and the latest major mini launch as I introduce the Psycho Assassin. A hectically roided up death machine, a one-man apocalypse you may say. This is what you get when you play assassination games and ignore the stealth tutorial, guns blazing. He'll literally inject you with the juice that flows through his veins, but it'll make you pop while he gets to go turbo. He also carries a needle pistol as well as a wicked knife. In my opinion, this is how the Psycho Assassin should look, and I'm glad to bring him to life in all of his glory. Also comes with custom base. We also have May's War Chest now available, basically a mystery box full of minis with value way higher than buying the minis outright. As a hint, May's War Box holds a carry case worth over $100 by itself, alongside all the minis that come with it. The value is insane, you won't be disappointed. It's an unreal deal and shipping is free. Happy Friday, links are below. Today we'll go over the period of time where the Assassins ruled the Imperium, how they came to power, why they took power, how well they did in power, and how they were eventually removed. Let's get into it. The Imperium just after the age of the Primarchs was a strange place. Everyone was kind of left with their thumbs up their ass, or however that saying goes. It was like inheriting all your father's assets as a 9-year-old, except your father was the king of Earth. To make matters worse, the Orcs randomly became powerful as hell and massively threatened the Imperium in what would be known as the War of the Beast. Now the threat was mostly because the Orcs were powerful as hell. After all, they had attack moons, and they were led by Orcs that were borderline Krorks and were more powerful than Primarchs. For those that don't know, Krorks were the original form of the Orcs, created by the old ones to be the frontline soldiers in a war that involved gods. They were 12 meters tall. The Beast, although not a true Krork, wasn't far off and was able to outmuscle Vulcan, so yeah, they're no joke. However, the second issue was how useless most of the Imperial government had become. Without Primarchs or the Emperor to lead them, the High Lords were in this dick measuring contest, plotting against each other, hiding key intel from each other, and even sabotaging each other, making the war effort against the Beast a lot harder than it needed to be. Draan Vangorich was the Grand Master of the Assassins at the time. He originally was a Venom assassin, those that specialize in poisons. However, he had shown aptitude for multiple schools of assassins, having the combat prowess of an Eversaw and even being able to use a limited amount of Calidus shapeshifting, thus he made for a good Grandmaster. He was also utterly disgusted with how the Imperium's upper echelons were dealing with the Beast. They should have all thrown their pettiness aside and united against the threat, but they weren't, so he decided to act. In multiple brilliant moves, Vangorich united the Imperium against the Beast. He first poisoned the Lord of the Ecclesiarchy, telling him he had 3 days to declare a war of faith against the Beast if he wanted the antidote. He also sent assassins to the Inquisition to warn them to stay off his back and to focus on the Beast instead. He also sent agents to the Mechanicus to see what they were hiding from the rest of the Imperium, which turned out to be them studying Orc teleportation tech. Vangorich was infuriated when the current Imperial region of the Imperium decided to fly 100 million or so Imperial citizens and soldiers, unveiling with knives and basic guns, to the Orc attack moon above Terra to try to take it by force. This ended with all of them dying and leaving Terra with very little defenses. Thus, Vangorich had to help organize negotiations with the Orc diplomat instead, being shocked when the Orcs spoke well and demanded surrender instead of just being like, "Wah, Allahu Akbar." During the War of the Beast, Vangorich had a partner, someone he had taken under his wing, called Esad Wire, who was also a Venom assassin. He was Vangorich's most trusted man and undertook numerous missions for him. Esad becomes important later on, I just wanted to mention him now. Vangorich respected competency. He didn't just think he was better than everyone, so there were some High Lords he worked with. For example, when the Harlequins attacked the Imperial Palace to try send a message to the Emperor and were captured, Vangorich worked with another High Lord to stop their executions so the Imperium could hear the Harlequin's message and see what she had to say. He kept the High Lords mostly out of conflict with each other and became a close ally to Courland, the last surviving Imperial Fist, as the Imperial Fist are the ones who were hit hardest by the War of the Beast. He even got rid of the incompetent Lord Commander of the Imperium and put the Imperial Fist there instead. The dude wasn't this power-hungry villain, he genuinely was working his ass off to try save humanity. However, some early warning signs were starting to show, as Vangorich started assassinating anyone he thought was a liability to allow their positions to be taken by more competent people. For those he didn't outright kill but needed to keep a lid on, he put Calidus assassins to act as some of their bodyguards, telling them about it but not telling them which bodyguards he had replaced. Through great effort, the sacrifice of Vulcan, the moves by Vangorich, and a lot of plot, the Imperium defeated the beasts and the orcs were driven back. The Imperium was saved. The Imperial Fists, now led by Maximus Thane, left Terra on an eternal crusade to continue to hunt down the orcs, with Thane trusting Vangorich to ensure the Imperium and the High Lords would stay in check. Vangorich decided he would keep the High Lords in check behind the shadows, threatening them, putting Calidus bodyguards around them. However, when he discovered that the Mechanicus fabricated general had teleported Ulanor to a different region of space to continue studying it instead of destroying it as Thane had ordered, Vangorich snapped. He was fucking sick of everyone's bullshit. In an act now known as the Beheading, every single High Lord, other than the Inquisitorial representative Vineland, as well as the Captain General of the Custodes, obviously, were assassinated, most in one fell swoop, but a few had to be cleaned up, such as Assad Wire killing the Grand Provost Marshal of the Arbites. Vineland was spared because Vangorich saw her as competent, didn't want a civil war with the Inquisition, and was also romantically attracted to her. When Assad came to Vangorich to tell him the Provost Marshal was dead, Vangorich revealed all other High Lords other than the ones mentioned were also dead. This made Assad believe Vangorich had gone too far, so he attacked his master, but Vangorich overpowered him. Not wanting to kill his star pupil, but also wanting to punish him, he turned him into an Eversor assassin, a fate arguably worse than death. Now Vangorich didn't go, haha, I kill everyone, I'm the master now. He originally used Calidus assassins to take the forms of the dead High Lords to keep up appearances. Anyone who noticed didn't say anything because, you know, assassinations and whatnot. He then slowly retired each of them or faked their deaths, even though they were already dead, and replaced them with actual High Lords, but ones he saw as competent and loyal to him. Vinand didn't know what to do about Vangorich. However, after speaking with Thane, as well as the Grey Knights and other Inquisitors, they decided the best thing to do would be to work with Vangorich, as he was actually pretty solid and going against him would cause a civil war. So for the next 100 years, the Imperium was ruled by Vangorich and Vinand, with the various High Lords doing whatever they were told. Unsurprisingly, this was a time of Imperial prosperity. Terra was fortified and brought back from stagnation, the 4th Space Marine founding was successfully carried out, the Imperium's armies were rebuilt, corruption was massively reduced, and the High Lords were unified. Sure, there was also a spike in assassinations, but no one really gave a fuck. However, at about year 80, Vangorich's mind began to bend and then break from the strain of leadership. His effective tyrant status was only tolerated if it was effective and stable. However, he had begun ordering massacres, giving out random orders with no tactical basis, growing paranoid. Funnily enough, Vinand and Thane weren't sad or surprised. They were just like, yep, okay, he's now past his use-by date, time to get rid of him. They knew eventually he would crack. However, he was doing such a good job for such a long time, in a time when the Imperium needed a Vangorich, that they were willing to let him do his thing, knowing it would need to end at some point. Now, Vangorich wasn't even super far gone. It wasn't like he was causing the kind of issues George Vandai would, but if left unchecked, he would have. So Thane returned to Terra with his men and spoke to Vinand. She told Thane Vangorich was in the Eversor Temple, so Thane took 400 Marines there to confront him. Vangorich was waiting and had 100 Eversor assassins with him. As we know, Eversors are one of the few Imperial units that reliably beat Space Marines in combat. However, they are also obscenely hard to create, train, and somewhat use, so 100 would have represented more or less the entire contingent on Terra at the time. The fight was as brutal as it was fast. 399 Space Marines died, 99 Eversors died, leaving only a wounded Thane, Vangorich, and one final Eversor. Vangorich did his little monologue and said goodbye to Thane, ordering the final Eversor to kill him. However, that Eversor turned out to be Assad, his partner who he had turned into an Eversor. Assad's willpower allowed him to resist this final order, giving Thane enough time to draw his bolt pistol and point it at Vangorich. Vangorich was surprised, with his last words being, "Would you like me to tell you the story of how Conrad Kurz died?" Thane pulled the trigger and the reign of Vangorich ended. For those curious on why Vangorich mentioned Conrad Kurz in his final words, it's because the Officio Assassinorum is the only non-Primarch or above entity to have a confirmed kill on a Primarch, that being when a Calidus assassin cut off Conrad's head, so they were pretty chuffed about that one, even though it was technically an assisted suicide, but no one really knows that. Why didn't the Custodes get involved? If Vangorich seized the Imperium, surely they would have something to say about it. No, not really. The Custodes don't really give a fuck about the Imperium's politics or High Lords. They care about the Emperor and the Emperor alone. If the Emperor is not threatened, they will not act. Sure, threats to the Imperium's safety can constitute a threat to the Emperor, but Vangorich was not a threat. He was actually the Custodes' ideal High Lord. When George Vandai was in control during the Reign of Blood, the Custodes stepped in only after he had gone completely to shit and the Imperium was on the brink of ruin. Vangorich wasn't even remotely close to that level of problematic. He was killed not because he was ruining the Imperium, but because he was probably going to start ruining the Imperium, and Thane was just being proactive after seeing seeing the warning signs. The Officio Assassinorum have always seen themselves as the ones to keep the other High Lords in check. Their existence often keeps the worst of the High Lords' desires from manifesting. However, in this instance, Vangorich did go too far. If he instead did the beheading, took over for a few decades, and then returned to his neutral position as an equal amongst the High Lords, things would have been fine. However, the lore detailing such a respected, competent, and useful dude going too far is a lot more interesting. Either way, out of all the wacky lore that came out during the War of the Beast saga, Vangorich was a highlight. If you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, then pick up a Psycho Assassin. He's angry, horny, and ready to fuck. Hit the subscribe button, hit the real subscribe button for more deadly content. Join the Discord for more memes, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.